Now it is my really wonderful pleasure to introduce a great dear friend of Olana and myself, Sarah Coffin. And Sarah is, you know, an esteemed historian of decorative arts and design, and was, I believe, 18 years at the Cooper Hewitt as, and I'm sorry, I want to make sure I get titles right, and I had it pulled up here, just one second, as the senior curator and head of product design and decorative arts at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And she retired in 2018. So it has been a great pleasure to see more of her in our area and at Olana since 2018. She's now an independent decorative arts and design consultant, curator, and lecturer. And she's also a member, I'm very, very proud and happy to say, of Olana's National Advisory Committee, which is this wonderful group of specialists from around the country who advise us and have a very active engagement with our interpretation, our exhibitions, our planning. And so it's wonderful to have Sarah as part of that group. So Sarah, thank you so much. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and it's a great pleasure to do this. I also want to thank the whole staff at Olana, especially Will Coleman and Mark and Allegra Davis, who provided photographs, and Margot, because it was really a big help. I also want to give a shout out to my former colleague, Emily Orr, who blessedly helped me find some photographs, as a good deal of what where I am now has things in storage. So I have not been able to get at all the images. I'm just going to put you on the share screen with the presentation so we can get going. And let me just, okay. And then we'll put that in. Great. So I am going to talk to you this evening about, not about Frederic, whoops, I managed to delete myself, not about Frederic Church, but about Lockwood de Forest, who was a major factor actually at Olana, but even more so just in the decorative arts and design world that I inhabited. Before I do, I want to first of all give a shout out to both Karen Zukowski, who originally, when doing a thesis on the furnishings at Olana, signaled de Forest's work, and then later Roberta Mayer, who has of course written a book on de Forest and subsequent articles, as well as curating all the Raj that was the exhibition inspired by the idea of the passion for the exotic that Cooper Hewitt and Olana timed to be synchronized, or partly synchronized, with the Cooper Hewitt having de Forest designed teak room, which was the Carnegie family's family library. So with that in mind, there's a lot of combination of interests of both museums, and particularly with the extraordinary collection of over 2,000 church drawings and paintings that are at Cooper Hewitt, a gift of Louis Church. Lockwood de Forest, as a young adult, aspired to a career in painting, despite initial family pressure to be a lawyer. His great uncle by marriage was Frederic Church, the celebrated artist, obviously, and Church and the de Forest family socialized both in New York and at Olana and going abroad. In 1868, both the Churches and de Forest traveled separately to Europe, but they spent time together in Rome, where Church introduced de Forest, age 18, not only to some other painters who were painting in Rome, but also to antique shopping. And in the following April—
Sarah?
Yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We just had a few requests. Can you put your full screen on the PowerPoint so it just makes things a little larger?
I was trying, but it isn't, it wasn't going.
If you press from beginning, you did that?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll hold on. I'll do it again.
So sorry.
No, thank you. Good.
There we go.
Sorry, I was too quick with the switch the first time. Thank you. At any rate, so we have this combination of painting and shopping that's going on. And when they met the following spring in Athens, an interesting things happened. So first of all, here is Lockwood de Forest as an ebb zone in Greece in April of 1869. I think one of the things that's come out of sort of living with de Forest for a number of years now is that he must have been a truly very likable and rather fun-loving person. And you can see that in his pose and again in the smile as he painted in his later years. I also will make the point that he was not alone in this endeavor, and perhaps we haven't given enough credit to Maeda de Forest, whom he married in 1880. And here she is on the right of the screen in a carved ivory portrait in a carved teakwood niche frame that was made for the de Forests when they went to India on their honeymoon right after their wedding and stayed over a year. In fact, buying a studio, or rather making arrangement with a group of these mistri, master craftsmen, who were organized by a member of the Hutta Singh family in Ahmedabad in India, which is in Gujarat, near the west coast. It used to be on the coast, but they traveled all over, not only getting these craftsmen to create designs that de Forest would base on traditional designs, but also buying things that both de Forest might sell, but also, frankly, that he was supplying to Tiffany and Company to sell. This cake saw that we acquired via a direct, from a descendant, shows a picture of tents and mountains in the background. And in fact, Maeda was absolutely fearless, and her letters that are in the Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian show that she sometimes writes letters talking about the rats running over her or the bed bugs or whatever. But I turned that off. I'm so sorry. And so the upshot of this was that that she participated in all of this wholeheartedly, business and everything else. So I think that we really, as I said, the fact that they went up to the Himalayas, and this could be a picture, and it could have been a Lockwood sketch that then was applied to a piece of silver that might have been a wedding present, who knows. But as I rather think that the scene is based on perhaps their camping in India, which, as I said, you must remember in 1881 was something we wouldn't have done. Now, I mentioned that de Forest saw church in Europe, and in fact, they painted together, and perhaps possibly for the first time. It's unclear whether he painted with Church on his visit to Olana just before, but I don't think so, because the house wasn't finished. So here they are in 1869, and Church is essentially giving him a lesson in composition, and they're sitting side by side with the broken columns of the Parthenon, Church on the left, de Forest on the right, and obviously you can see Church's already experienced talent there. But I think the fact is that he looked on de Forest very much as probably as a member of the family, as he was distantly related, but it also as someone whom he felt he could indeed help with paintings. De Forest was not, however, one of Church's few official students. Church had 3 formal students, William James Stillman, Jarvis McEntee, and Walter Lunt Palmer. It's probably de Forest met de Palmer through Church, as it was Palmer who recorded his first decorating commission, de Forest, which was in fact his parents' house in New York in 1876. And I think you will see that that Walter Lunt Palmer, I should say, by the way, those two paintings, now Cooper Hewitt already had the church sketch of the broken columns of the Parthenon that he was probably going to work up for a painting, but perhaps not. And then, but has more recently acquired the de Forest version. So now they're both there. In any case, Palmer records this view, which I think you can see 1876 is before de Forest goes to India, and he is doing it very much in the Middle Eastern taste, and with lots of bric-a-brac and things from trips. You know, but that's a Satsuma vase, but on a Damascus style table over on the left, and this fretwork trellising around an arched opening, and the sort of step, not to mention the use of quote unquote Oriental carpets everywhere, which you also see in Olana. And now the thing that I started to realize in working on this was, here you have the first decorative arts commission, shall we say, decorating commission of de Forest in 1876 with at his parents' house 4 years before he goes to India, and 3 years before he becomes a member of the Associated Artists with Louis Comfort Tiffany and Samuel Coleman, all together. That in fact was his contribution, was going to be going to India and making part of their work Indian inspired. On the right, I show you a smoking room in the Turkish taste by a French artist somewhat later, but I think you will see also that this idea of the Moorish was popular, not just obviously in Europe as well, but also allowed for complete combinations of either French Rococo style or Jacobean or anything else you wanted. We move on, I think, with a certain, I just want to flip back if you look at the Forest house. And here we have the staircase hall at Olana, indeed with the same sort of steps up between levels, the multitude of patterning that's going on. And the fact was that de Forest was at Olana right as it was being completed, and had visits there. So Olana may have served more to steer de Forest towards the interior design in his profession than in working up paintings, you know, as a future career. In fact, the family certainly, and until recently, but also many people thought of him primarily as a painter, until a closer examination of his work has brought to light many more of his Indian commissions. And I think that's because he returned to painting when he moved out to Santa Barbara, California in the early 20th century, having made his last trip to India in 1913, just before World War I, and finding that the taste for the exotic had somewhat gone out of European and American interiors. But this gives us a chance to see the kind of things that probably de Forest and the churches collected while in their travels in the Middle East, in Greece, and in Rome, hitting the antique shops. But you'll get what looks like a beadry ware on a mother of pearl inlaid Damascus table. This chair has been tentatively attributed to Lockwood de Forest or not, but may have come out of his workshop to some design by someone else. It's unclear, but the overall melange of carpets and patterns by Church based on Middle Eastern subjects is all very evident. And in fact, Lockwood de Forest says, "I became deeply interested in Oriental art when, as a boy of 20, I studied over the books then obtainable by Mr. Frederic Church, when in 1870 he was planning his house at Hudson in Oriental style." Now, in those days, Oriental was used to mean anything in Asia, whether South Asia, East Asia, or whatever. But I think it's important. And in fact, the specific books are in the library at Olana, and they involve both French views and of specific Near Eastern scenes. Here is a painting by Lockwood de Forest before he goes to India. So he's relying on his Middle Eastern travels to show a rug merchant's bazaar with the rug stacked up. And on the right, I do show a painting sketch from when he was in India. That's a Cooper Hewitt from 1881. But you can see interest always in the textiles, in the patterns of jollies, in the patterns of the woodwork that so influenced his style. He also, as I mentioned, traveled a lot. And these chairs, which are very European in style, after all, you have to remember that the Indians weren't sitting around on chairs, but they're sort of a odd interpretation of a European or American style chair. But they know that they're for a Westerner, but at the same time, they use Asian motifs. There's one at Olana that's in a dark green with the patterning, and then these two with the white and gilt, which de Forest would have ordered up in cashmere. And here is very typical of Kashmiri lacquer work applied to the chair, but at the same time, you essentially have an upright spindle-back chair that you might have found in 17th century New England with some slight modifications. But this white and gilt was also quite a popular color combination in other interiors of the era, and we'll see that on the one of the mantelpieces in the East Parlor. I show you what an influence Olana was on de Forest quite a bit later, because this is his own house that he didn't create until well into the 1880s, I think 1887, with this patterned arch of wood carved in Ahmedabad at the studio that the Huttisings ran for him. Here is the lacquer chair that he owned, which is probably the mate to this one, and also a Kashmiri made stool, which involved his taking the designs from a book of Indian designs of bedposts and shrinking them down to make a stool. You also see a sofa made of panels of the carved woodwork. So the variety, and there's more along the bookcases and everything else, and probably a large amount of gilt foiling on the top. Other things, other items that are on the interior are too dark to see. But again, you see the general patterning of an entrance hall with textiles hung on rods and so forth that can be compared to Olana, but at about 15 years later. I mentioned the white and gilt border. Here is the fireplace in the East Parlor at Olana with the Ahmedabad carved woodwork around it, and this white and gilt border to the fireplace. And that the chairs are opposite it. So they're perhaps, again, a sense of bringing those in. Now you have to, that even if the immediate fireplace surround was there prior to de Forest setting up his studio in 1881, it's clear that his coming back, one of the made places at Olana that has a de Forest input are the fireplaces, and almost all of them have some woodwork from Ahmedabad arranged in various strips in combinations of different patterns with these corbels underneath that replicate like temple roof corbels. And I show you another example of a fireplace surround totally by de Forest, where he also had the studio do brass work with pierced patterning that related to patterns he would collect. Now, the distinction between de Forest design and contemporary designs being done at the same time, including by the Huttising studio when they weren't doing orders for De Forest, which was mostly later, but was the effuse amount of pattern. You think this is dense? Well, you should see Bombay Blackwood furniture of the same date. It's incredibly dark and dense with just all over patterning. And very often referential to what we would consider more Victorian Rococo revival taste when they made things in Bombay, as it was then, Mumbai, for the Western market. However, De Forest edited, he took motifs from ancient stonework, woodwork, and metalwork and reconfigured them into essentially patterns that he could use in multiple media. The fireplace surround is brass, and he commissioned hundreds of brass patterns for people to use to decorate and increase the light in their rooms. But they also relate to the panels in Indian jali, and the jali are these screens that have well, here's a good example, excuse me, of the brass work, but it may have been the thicker version could have been used as an essentially sun blocker, but letting sunlight in and definitely letting air in the hot Indian sun. I show you his commitment to these patterns when years later, in 1912, he produced a book of designs with the idea that these were sort of usable for woodwork and brass work. The detail in the middle is the wall of Cooper Hewitt's Olana, Cooper Hewitt's Carnegie House family library, which has almost the same pattern as on the cover of the book, which is an illustration of a piece of brass. But in this case, he's used stencils. And in fact, in his work, he doesn't provide stencil patterning, and he had created whole books of paper stencils that could either be applied to the wall or in fact used as they are at Cooper Hewitt in the Carnegie Family Library. And then it's bordered by this pattern of foliate vine work, which is one of the most popular of his patterns. Here you see it surrounding another fireplace at Olana in the East Parlor with this same trailing. I mean, this is a different trailing vine, but it's a simplification. This is yet a third version, and so you have pattern 1 up here and pattern 1 up here and pattern 2, 3, 4, and take note of these little corbels here with these sort of stylized motifs, because I will talk about the dining room fireplace later. As I mentioned, that the Mistry carvers were the ones who the Huddising family had used to create a temple, a Jain temple. They were all Jains, and the Jain religious tradition going back about 1,000 years, where the temples provided much opportunity for the workmen. However, with the collapse in cotton prices around the Civil War, the Huddisings could not afford to keep building at the rate they'd been building, and so we're delighted to find De Forest interested in maintaining Indian craftsmanship, and he had a sort of moral crusade about this. And so they made this, I think, as a wedding present, the niche with the ivory carving a portrait of Maeda De Forest, which actually says, engraved by the chief Mistry of your woodworking, wood carving wood shop, Ahmedabad, in English on the back, which they then gave to them. But the fact was that the factory, the Mistry, must have liked carving niches, which would have normally presumably held Buddhas and other sculpture. And so indeed, De Forest got them to carve one for the churches. And so this one, which is in the hallway as you come in on your sort of facing towards the studio, De Forest has done a very logical thing, in thinking of it as for something for church, but presumably church made the decision to pick out the ceramic Madonna from Mexico, I believe, to put in it. But behind it, you will see the de Forest signature design with vines. And then this, the top, the pediment with the arches. Again, look at that. There is a squatting Buddhist-like figure or Jain figure in the temple up here, who I think will reappear in the dining room. One last note on niches is this rather foggy illustration is from the 1903 Delhi exhibition catalog and of the work of the Ahmedabad wood carving studio, which was exhibited, which was still in de Forest's hands at that point. Ultimately, he did actually sell it, as he was not a good businessman. I mean, he sold his ownership of the studio to Louis Comfort Tiffany, his former partner in design. And Tiffany had used de Forest even after they split up being partners. But Tiffany could never communicate the way de Forest could. And so de Forest ended up doing most of the orders for Tiffany, doing the communications even after he'd sold his rights in the studio. But you'll notice one, two, three niches. This is the balustrade. I think you will see is that archetypal vine and foliate flower motif, again with a similar pattern but its own distinctive one going around the edges, and then the pedestals at the end, which also relate to the dining room pedestals, showing different patterns. Here we have to the same general time, we have this Indian woodwork that is at Olana. And if you look up on this sort of laminated, it's almost it's sort of leather, almost like leather. It may in fact be lacquered leather, but pattern that is at the Mark Twain house, which is attributed to associated artists. But I think it's very clear, the date of the attribution is partly based on the fact that they were all still in business together then, and they do know they worked at the Twain house. But it also does suggest that it was based on the influence of some of these Indian designs coming back with de Forest. This one shows the particular pattern that is at Cooper Hewitt in its teak room that's featured heavily throughout the room, but in combination with about 6 other patterns and corbels in the room. And this is in fact an old Ahmedabad Haveli, a sort of house that has this sort of vine going up here, but also these trailing vines with foliage that were his source. But I think you can see here, it's hard to see in the picture from Cooper Hewitt, but except with the details. But even though these seem very busy to our eyes, they are nothing compared to those Haveli fronts that he was seeing as a model. Now, I've mentioned you might wonder how, having gone back to the United States in the end of 1881, early 1882, they were to communicate about all these commissions. The Carnegie Mansion isn't till 1902. But I think what happened is that, we know, because I saw them, that he brought back several sets of wood panels, and here you see how it worked. On the back of this one, which is owned by a descendant of his, is N4, and the N4 is the number of that particular size and shape of paneling. And then what I found excuse the lousy photography, but the studio was pitch black. Here in Ahmedabad, in the descendant of the Hudson owns the studio now, and he has this sort of mini, he has a sort of an archive room, and here is the same pattern as was used at Cooper Hewitt, but all sorts of other patterns with the corresponding numbers on them. So what clearly happened was that de Forest had several sets, so we could give a sample out to a client to try out or have them play around with combinations in his office, and this was how you do it. And he ordered up large amounts. And so I think what happened was you'd wonder how he could get it so exactly. He didn't, based on the amount of elements and strips of just unused strips that were in his house in Santa Barbara and the garage and in his descendants' possessions. I have to think he over ordered of all the patterns he was going to need for any given commission in order to make sure he had enough, and then could possibly use some for additional work if it came along later. This shows you his involvement, that actually this was while he was still in India. He just wasn't in Ahmedabad. So he's writing, having received somewhere else, perhaps they sent on to the client some sample brass panels and wanted them thinner. So he was very engaged. He wrote long letters. There don't seem, his orders are frustrating because he doesn't think the Huddisings need to know what the name of the client is. So unless it's Tiffany himself, he doesn't usually say so. But this desk, which I have pondered at some length and has not been as strongly thought to be by de Forest initially, I think might be a good example of a piece of furniture where he had a good deal of these strip elements that he'd ordered and was using around and about the place, and probably also ordered up the teak, the plain panels of teak. But this one may well have been assembled of de Forest ordered elements at his bidding once it got to Olana. Other pieces, and there's a side view of it, and you can see the trailing vine that so clearly connects it to de Forest studio. Other pieces, this is a detail from the cabinet in the studio, show again very clearly de Forest panels. This one actually is the same as this one. It's just done, I mean, it's just a different sort of grain, probably a different type of teak. But I think that despite the fact that de Forest is, and here's the whole thing, de Forest is known to have had pieces made up in Ahmedabad and actually shipped in their entirety. Things like glass doors, obviously, I think would have been applied locally, and quite a bit of the furniture could have been assembled or even made up locally. I think the cabinets, based on the color and type of teak that are used on the door frames, probably were made up all but the glass in Ahmedabad. The desk less likely, but you can see he's still using. Here's the trim on the fireplace. Maybe we can, if you want to, I'm just going to minimize myself for a minute so you can see. This is the trim on the fireplace with the Persian tiles, and here's the same border on the trim of the cabinet. So I'm sure he had a good deal of that that stripping to go along, so it really could have been made anywhere, but definitely under his supervision. Now, these Tabare tables, this one's in the studio, and I think it makes a wonderful combination with the carpet, because look at the patterning of the shape of the lozenges here and the ones on the openings of the table. This is another one that came up at Christie's a few years ago. I found others in other locations, including a large commission he had at Bryn Mawr for the deanery, for other rooms, also for Elizabeth Garrett, who was at Bryn Mawr, but also at her own house in Baltimore. So these were clearly made as products that were made at the studio to be sold on the open market, and this was not something peculiar to Church. This particular piece, he would have had some in stock, probably in his own shop, and or supplied this first to Church. He did obviously consider the aspect of the tiles, the elaborate tiles, when working on the borders, because these are really very different. There's one similar border to this in Andrew Carnegie's bedroom at Cooper Hewitt, but it's not the same. And so I do think it is a little different from the more traditional architectural elements that are based on Gujarati architecture that he used otherwise. Um, so getting back, so just to show you that there's also this around this, these two are the same, and this is the detail. This is not the same border that was on the other, but it is closer to the trailing vine that's on the desk. Now, lastly, we have the fireplace and the whole mantle construct. And I'm going to again move myself out of the way here so you can see the drawing. And this is a drawing done by Church, a detail of the fireplace he's thinking about or wanting to make in the dining room in about 1872. It's got definitely influenced by the sort of Gothic, English Victorian Gothic revival. East Lakean forms the lancet windows, and he's drawn in this pointed arch. So he's thinking about it, but otherwise it doesn't look there's the arch down here that he's thinking about and various alternatives and something to hold up a couple of pots. But there are no pedestals, and it may be an intention of having a niche here, which he hasn't drawn in very well. But it does show that he's really designed this fireplace. And yet when you look at it, you can just see, this is good with a raking light, that you can see the patterning in the brass and the patterning here, that the pedestals are absolutely by Lockwood de Forest and therefore date to the 1880s. And I do also feel here you see Buddha in this group of figures that also look very like some Indian silver figures that are on a tatsa, a footed salver that's in the De Forest family collection. There's also engraved patterning up here, all of which appears to have been the creation of the Ahmedabad studio. I don't know whether the vases are or not, but I think it shows that Church must have, if he did something, it may have been a more multicolored marble, or just trimmed up, or perhaps with floral inlay, some sort of Italianate thing, and design. But it clearly, the final version does appear to be a case of De Forest taking Church's design in a sketch form, not that one, but probably a pencil sketch that he would have sent to the Huddisings, or maybe even taken to them when he went on his trip in the 1880s, and had them make it up according to Church's design. You remember I said, watch those palmettos and shapes that are on the other mantelpiece that's over, I think, in the East Parlor. There they are again, connecting them up. And this idea of patterning behind the figure shows up in a combination Tiffany and De Forest clock with a pendulum that hangs down between behind, with carving behind like that. And this is the balcony from the temple, Jain temple of the late 16th century, that is now at the Metropolitan Museum, and which in fact De Forest bought for the Metropolitan Museum on his trip in 1913. The World War I held up the shipping, and it didn't arrive until after the war. So I think it has a 1917 or something, or maybe 18 accession number, or maybe it got through during the war, but very slowly. And you again have the squatted figure, Jain figure, with the covered pedestals on either side forming an arch, as well as these figures that are in this case in the bas-relief, again with the kind of similar patterning up on the top that's here, And so this is the old Jain architecture that he's looking at. And in fact, by the 19th century, de Forest is having the craftsmen make things that are a lot closer to the ancient and old ones, ancient by year 1000, I would say. And here's the whole thing. I mean, this is what's at the Met, the ceiling with its gods peering down, and the balconies, and again, this structure with a figure in an arch, and the jollies with the piercing to let the air through, and then rows of figures separated by columns. And so, and here again, up at the top, you have figures set in niches on this crest, which does somewhat emulate the crest there. I just here to show you the in more detail. You would certainly recognize the pedestals as being de Forest. And for a long time, I wondered if de Forest hadn't added the pedestals to a design that Church might have made up himself and had done in the Middle East. But when I looked at the patterning on the brasswork, and then I could found the patterning of these corbels and the arches, that all, and the vine right here, all is de Forest's Ahmedabad work. It has to have all been made in the de Forest studio in Ahmedabad in the 80s. And the only question seems to me is, one day, maybe in the archives somewhere, either at Olana or in the Archives of American Art, we will, find a drawing sent over to the Huddisings, but that actually went to them. But sadly, their archives mostly burned at the studio. So it would be only a case if a preliminary one still survives. But so the overall impression that while this gives you a head-on view, you don't see the engraving and etching in the brasswork. But it is not, when you look at that, this is no longer a Victorian English Ruskinian mantle surround. It is very definitely an Asian conceit by Western designers. And it does seem to me that Church allowed de Forest to significantly alter his original intention in doing this, that this really makes it a collaborative work of Frederic Church and Lockwood de Forest. And to my mind, this is a very exciting thing about this house as to why those of us who are in the decorative arts and design see the interplay between these two men, not just as about painting together, but painting their interior environments as well. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very anxious to hear what questions people might have.
Thank you, Sarah, very, very much. There's just so much amazing content in there. I always feel like you open my eyes to things that, I've been walking through those interiors and seeing those pieces so many times in a day or a week, but just the sort of specific patterns and the depth of research and life that you shared with de Forest in your career is amazing. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. Please, everyone, do share questions as we go along here, and I will do my best attempt to get everything answered. I'm going to start with an overarching one that is from Will Coleman, our Director of Collections and Exhibitions, who, as always, is very much on the same wavelength I am. And I'll read his question, and maybe I can expand a little bit on some thoughts I had that I wonder about your comments on. Will is saying, from your life's journey with de Forest, Sarah, could you help us to understand whether or not there were specific associations of India and its traditional design for late 19th century American audiences? He's wondering whether you have any thoughts about what these objects would have meant or evoked in that time for Americans in this context, beyond the sort of, the Orientalism idea, the sort of exoticism of the objects. And I will add one little coda to that, which is specifically, I've always been curious in my 5 years at Olana, why the sort of Isabel's sitting room fireplace was one of the only ones not given over to Lockwood de Forest.
Well, I answer the last part first. I've always felt that that did signal a close relationship of Frederic Church to his younger protege, family member, whatever. And it's actually through Isabel, I think, that they're related. So it must have been her personal taste and wanting her space. But I also think that, you know, as far as the bigger question of the Orientalism, I think that really Church and de Forest too were a little bit in advance of their day. There wasn't that much interest in or knowledge of Indian art, except in perhaps the manuscript area at the time in 19th century America. The British, of course, because it was colonial for them, they were certainly aware, but it ironically, it took John Lockwood, whose name was Lockwood, but I found no relationship, John Lockwood Kipling, who was known as Lockwood usually, starting a school in Lahore of traditional crafts as well as painting. That really brought to light this sort of moral sense of maintaining the integrity of craftsmanship, just the way it was going on at the founding of the V&A, that England had fallen on bad design, Europe had, America had, we were all too industrial, and that we needed to go back to our craft roots. So it was born of an interest of William Morris-like theology almost, to save this this craftsmanship which was honest and had its cultural interest. And de Forest met Kipling in Lahore, and they became good friends, and he actually worked on Rudyard Kipling's house in Vermont. So this definitely played a role with him, and he felt he was sort of helping save the crafts of India by having his studio in Ahmedabad and wanting to keep it going. He did go there 3 times, but the big trip, one big trip was 1891-2, when he went to buy things, as well as have his studio copy certain things that he was finding, particularly jewelry, as well as woodwork, but brasswork. And all of that was for both the Tiffany and Company display of the arts of India for the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition. So by this point, the Olana's already done, but that did certainly introduce Americans in a much bigger way. And Marshall Field ended up with their rugs on on de Forest design woodwork. So did W&J Sloan, selling their carpets. And in fact, one of the reasons I showed the carpet in the front hall, the one that has been on the staircase for conservation, is that the Sloans and the Churches and the Osbornes and everybody were all good friends. And Sloan's gave de Forest a commission to look into Indian-made carpets, and he wanted to get them out of being made in jails so he could support rug makers in an honest profession. So there's a small group of people with a sort of mission to make this part of life, but it had a relatively short blast. As I said, initially it was just part of the layers of patterning, that it could be Persian, it could be Indian, it didn't really matter. And it evolved into Indian, and then it disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared.
So the window is really about 20, 25 years?
Well, it's really the late 70s, 80, 81 when de Forest starts, up till World War I. But it really, his commissions, the reason he was anxious to sell to Tiffany was that Tiffany was almost the only one getting any commissions, and he would invariably mix the Indian in with designs of other, like Middle Eastern persuasion, and try to get the Ahmedabad studio to make a lot of things that might be Moroccan or Syrian in design source.
So just to flog the horse one more time, you're seeing the arts and crafts kind of impulse to craftsmanship and to a pre-industrial sort of, mythology, but not connecting it to spiritual kind of Jainism content.
Oh no, I think the reason he had the craftsman whose predominant work prior to having him come along was working on Jain temples as well as fixtures, but they were not making this sort of balloon-shaped chairs in deep Bombay wood for export.
Right.
Now, it should be said that when I went to the Huddising descendant's house, he had both types, all made by the same studio. The things for the West had this cleaned up slightly Western aesthetic, and then there was the Bombay Blackwood style that the family's own carvers had made, but it was for their own use to stay in India. But I think the Western idea was to cut down on excess design, and
I look forward to continuing the conversation about kind of the kind of the iconographic significance within the Olana context as we learn more about the collection and what things are no longer visible because they need conservation or otherwise. So I just point that out. A couple other questions. I believe you answered Arita's Warren's question. Hi, Arita, which is what was the relationship between Lockwood de Forest and John Lockwood Kipling? You said that there was no direct family resemblance. I know that de Forest met John L., but was there a family connection? You said no, right?
There's not none that I could find, no.
Okay, working backwards through the list of questions here so far. Allison Park says, would the brass within the house, the brass you've shown, I guess brass in any of Lockwood's work, have been highly polished?
Well, the foils that he did, which were very highly shiny, seem to maintain it. I don't know if there was a lacquer applied or whether because it's a foil, it just is by definition shiny. But the strips of where it could be like brass mountings, like whether it's, locks or keys or whatever, or bigger pieces, the thicker pieces now are, fairly dull, but I think the intention was absolutely to have them highly polished, because just as in the 18th century, you're still pre-electricity for the most part, and the aim was to have things that caught the light to brighten up all this dark wood.
For those of you who are real, aficionados here, I would encourage you to come to Olana on a end of the day tour at some point when we're open again, and ask if it isn't open, if the communicating doors between the dining room and the east parlor can be opened, because you will get almost like a Stonehenge-ish kind of effect of the light coming in through those southwestern windows towards the end of the day, and a beam almost hitting the brass, which is one of the few times that, until we do something about the overall lighting conditions at Olana, which hopefully will not be too far off, but it is very dim in the dining room. It's hard to appreciate it. So a couple other questions. One about associations. Joanna Titus, who was one of our prior speakers. Hi, Joanna and Bob. Was Candace Wheeler considered a member of the Associated Artists along with the men?
Yes.
Local, having co-founded Onteora Park in Hunter.
Right. And yes, she definitely was. And I personally think it may be she who is responsible for the wall coverings at the Mark Twain house based on some of the Indian things that were coming back. It's very similar to her style. And De Forest very much, I think, wanted to work with her. The whole problem there was that it wasn't economically viable. And so when he went to India, technically he was both working with associated artists, and then he and Tiffany on the side had signed a contract to be partners in a decorating business, just the two of them. But even when that dissolved, he continued to supply Tiffany in a friendly fashion and so on. So I think he also had other dealings with Candace Wheeler after the association dissolved.
Thank you. Sarah, we are at time, but if you're okay, can we go another couple
Yeah, sure.
questions?
Fine.
So just before we do that, as people may be signing off based on their plans, I want to make one more plug for things happening at Olana. This year, instead of our usually fabulous summer party, our summer fundraiser has been turned into the Olana Viewshed Tour. And you can find out all sorts of information about it on our website, but it's a wonderful opportunity to go to amazing private places, houses and gardens, only outdoors. It's a socially distanced, public safety, health safety event, but within 5 miles of Olana on both sides of the river. So please, I hope if that interests you, that you'll consider joining us for that day, August 15th, from 12 to 5, with a gourmet picnic lunch thrown in for the taking. So now just a couple more questions. We have one about other relationship. Here it is. Nina Blomfield says, thank you so much for the interesting talk. I wonder if there are any connections between Olana and the Carnegies. Would Andrew Carnegie have been thinking of Olana when he commissioned De Forest to decorate the teak room?
Actually, no, although he was connected to some of the people who, I mean, the Sloanes would have knew both. But the fact is that I think that the way that Carnegie got to meet De Forest was that De Forest and Tiffany and Howard Russell Butler, who is a painter whom Carnegie knew, were all founding members of the Society of American Artists, of which Carnegie was one of the principal funders and founders. And in fact, they all sat nearby each other at the founding dinner. And I think that Carnegie decided to hire Butler to organize the different people, contractors who were going to be making the interior of the Carnegie Mansion. And Butler was a friend of De Forest's, and Carnegie knew him and thought it would be great. And Carnegie must have liked the Indian taste, because even though there are no pictures of his bedroom from his lifetime, and the walls are just plain white now and appear to have nothing underneath them, that all the woodwork in his bedroom is De Forest woodwork. And I almost put in little corbels of elephants carved wood elephants that run along the underside of his mantle. So while the family library has been much published, it was a very private room, and obviously he kept that for himself. So I think his connection is through the general social world that they inhabited and his interest in sponsoring artists. But I don't think, only in that Frederic Church was also, it was no longer around when the Society of American Artists was founded in 1891, but he was no longer going to be able to participate. But he had, of course, introduced Lockwood de Forest to the same 10th Street studio building where all these artists all had their studios and got to know each other. So I think he indirectly could be said to have heard about De Forest from Church, but I think it was that way rather than from Olana.
Okay, very good. And I think our last question from Kate Moore in Washington, D.C. Please tell us about what exists today in India. Does the Ahmedabad wood carving studio of De Forest, they still exist? Is it continue today? Is it a museum? Do artisans still work there?
Well, it was a wonderful trip to be able to go there. Now, sadly, rather too long ago, and I actually then traveled on in De Forest's footsteps from his accounts of his travels. But the answer is the studio does still exist, although in a limited way. The building itself, the Haveli, is owned by a descendant, Umang Hata Singh, who is himself a textile designer and more particularly a fashion designer, and has created some very elegant, both men's clothing and robes and very luxurious things. He has kept the studio down below, and some of his textile workers work there. And while I was there, which is now 9 years ago, he 8 years ago, he was just starting up a woodworking studio, but he said he was not yet giving them big commissions because he was giving them small ones so that he would get the quality up before they did anything major. And they did at the time for De Forest, and apparently well into the 20th century. One of the last things the original workmen and their descendants did was to make jewelry too. And so that continued on, and I think he does have some people doing metalwork. So the answer is somewhat, primarily in textiles. Ahmedabad is a huge textile center. It used to be on the coast and had trade with Eastern Asia. It is no longer, but it is in an area of major textile design and so forth. And some of De Forest's own designs come from textiles. The ceiling of the Carnegie Family Library is definitely, it's all stenciled onto the ceiling in gold and red, but it is all based on an Indian textile design.
It's fantastic. I mean, the way in which these textile patterns and motifs are incorporated, and we had. Anyway,
so I appreciate that I'm between textiles and tiles, because the De Forest, in terms of the lectures, the De Forest woodwork surrounds the tiles and brasswork, and the textiles are the source of much of the design of Ahmedabad, and the interacting nature of textiles, stonework, and the temples and woodwork all use the same patterning that he picked up and translated.
By the way, I mean, when you showed the studio and the upstairs in the Sharp Family Gallery, those two mantle surrounds and the tiles there, from Muhammad Ali Isfahani, are going to be a principal focus of the next talk by Professor Amami, that, in particular. So one quick question. Bob Titus wonders, how large is the Maeda portrait in the niche?
Very small. I mean, that whole thing is only about 8 inches high, and the portrait's probably 4. I mean, so small.
Very
it's like a miniature portrait.
Easy to pack in the bags, or
yes.
Yeah.
That
and
one.
Will Roseman of the Explorers Club fame, he says, was Robert Weeks de Forest of Metropolitan Museum fame helpful in Lockwood's career? If so, to what extent?
That is a somewhat sore subject for Lockwood. They were very close. They remain close. But Robert, when he became, they're brothers, for anybody who didn't know, when Robert became president of the Metropolitan Museum, he did realize that Lockwood had thought he would just be allowed to go out on buying trips for the Metropolitan Museum, and Robert thought, you can do if you find something really great. When he found the Jain Temple for sale, okay, we'll buy it. Thank you. Great that you were able to get to it. But you will look, it's very camouflaged at the Met, but a lot of my research went into the provenance of those donations, and very frequently it'll say the Patrick Kennedy Memorial Fund, which actually meant that they purchased it from Lockwood de Forest. So his brother helped a lot, but because he did put a damper on it a bit, Lockwood always felt that art museums weren't necessarily the best place, and actually encourage natural history museums as sort of ethnographic art to acquire, and which is what happened at the Field Museum in Chicago, because Mrs. Marshall Field came along and bought up everything, the jewelry that wasn't sold, and Marshall Field in Chicago took the woodwork and used it in the carpet department, and she bought the jewelry, and it's all now at the Field Natural History Museum in Chicago. So he got his wish in a way, but it also is true that Robert himself bought and then gave a lot of things that Lockwood acquired in order to spread it as to who it was coming from.
And of course, it's Robert and Emily de Forest's photos of the 1880s at Alana that we really are a core document for our furnishing plan that Karen Zukowski created and developed. And so there's so many web of interconnections and relationships.
Exactly.
It's
I
absolutely
think
fascinating. Yeah.
that is
I
one
have
thing
to
that I
say,
wanted to talk about De Forest at Olana, is that it does seem that it's a cementing of a close family relationship, but that there is something particular between the sort of paternal aspect, but that he really does, he both creates an interior designer in the process a good deal before he has his first commission. So
wow, it's amazing. It is fascinating. I mean, I just have to say there has to be a dissertation topic, if it hasn't already been started or worked on, about this issue that you just brought up of anthropological collections versus art museum collections, because, it immediately clicks to my Kathy Manthorn finding the deed of gift for Church, giving those 2 Aztec plaques to the Met, where he says that, he hoped one day they would hang in a gallery dedicated to the art of all of the Americas, which we think is a wonderful sort of sentiment about the, Western Hemisphere being seen as an entity.
right.
But also, then hearing Sylvia Yunt give a talk about, at the Cole House a couple of years ago, about plans that, for the American Wing to start to integrate Native and Indigenous people's art into the American Wing idea, right? Which she said was really a Robert and Emily De Forest proposal back in the day. So I guess there was a push-pull between the 2 collections and wanting to get the good stuff in either one.
and you do need to remember, yes, that Robert and Emily De Forest gave the money for the American Wing, so which was at the time, and a lot of Duncan Fife style furniture and all sorts of other things of that ilk. And there was that's the other thing I guess I should say, is that there was no perception that in going Indian in part of your house, you had to go all out Indian. It was conceived as perfectly compatible because of its sort of moral component of the honesty of craftsmanship, as being compatible with colonial American furniture and so on, as well as arts and crafts movement, as well as all kinds of other things. You will, the De Forest House in Long Island, it was a crazy conglomerate of Lockwood furniture, Duncan Fife, all kinds of other things going on all at the same time as being perfectly normal. And you see a number of interiors like that, like the Deanery at Bryn Mawr too.
All right, Sarah. Well, thank you so much. Again, we'll end on that note of unity of the arts and peoples, and go forward. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much. Great. Bye-bye.